On May 25, 1887, in the rustic village of Pietrelcina, a small farming community in the southern Italian region of Campania, a fragile child came into the world. He was named Francesco Forgione, after St. Francis of Assisi, a sign of the family's deep devotion. The Forgione home was not unlike many others in the village, a cramped stone house with floors of packed earth, a hearth constantly fed by olive wood, and walls decorated with simple holy pictures. Life was hard, but faith made it bearable. Grazio, his father, and Maria Giuseppa, his mother, worked long hours in the fields, tending to the few acres of land and livestock that sustained them. They were poor, but their poverty was illuminated by a rich Catholic piety. Francesco was the fourth child in the family, though not all of his siblings survived infancy. His earliest memories were wrapped in the sounds of bells from the village church of Santa Anna, the chants of the Mass, and the steady rhythm of the rosary recited in the evenings by the fireplace. His mother, Maria Giuseppa, especially nurtured her children's faith. She kept a small altar in the home with a statue of the Madonna, and every night she gathered the children to kneel before it. She noticed something unusual in young Francesco almost from the start. Unlike other children who wriggled or grew distracted during prayers, he would grow solemn and fixed, as though he were listening to someone invisible. There are stories of his earliest years that capture the singular tone of his life. At the age of 5, while working in the fields, Francesco began to see what he later described as heavenly visions. He would tell his mother of a beautiful lady who appeared to him, clothed in brightness, urging him to be pure and never to offend Jesus. These weren't the fanciful tales of a child playing pretend. The boy spoke with an unshakable seriousness, and his mother, who was devout but practical, was both moved and unsettled. She would later recall how he often spoke of seeing angels, who he said kept him company in the lonely hours while tending the sheep. Life in Pietrelcina was harsh, and children grew up quickly. At the age of 10, Francesco was already helping with farm work, driving animals, and carrying bundles of wood from the hills. His body was thin and delicate, and the labor often exhausted him, but he bore it without complaint. Neighbors recalled seeing him pause in the middle of his chores to pray. One woman remembered coming upon him kneeling in the dirt beside the sheep, beads in his hands, lips moving silently. He seemed not to notice anything around him, she said, as though the whole world had disappeared and he was somewhere else. But not all of his childhood visions were consoling. He also spoke of dark figures that tormented him at night, monstrous forms that clawed and threatened. Once, he awoke screaming, his sheets drenched in sweat. When his parents asked what had frightened him, he said that demons had tried to drag him away. Such things were terrifying for a boy, yet he seemed to accept them as part of his lot. In later years, Padre Pio would describe how these struggles with the devil began in his earliest memory and never truly ceased. His childhood, then, was a mingling of light and shadow, the warmth of angelic companionship, and the terror of infernal assaults. The village priest soon noticed that Francesco was not like other boys. While others played in the square, he lingered near the church, sometimes for hours. He would kneel before the crucifix, eyes fixed on the suffering figure of Christ. The priest was moved by his fervor and encouraged his vocation. But for the Forgiones, the prospect of sending their son to seminary seemed almost impossible. Schooling required money, and money was always scarce. Francesco attended only a few years of primary school, struggling at first with reading and writing. Yet his persistence and his desire to study for the priesthood led his family to make sacrifices. At this point, Grazio, his father, made a decision that revealed the depth of their faith and their willingness to support their son's calling. He left Italy to work in America, traveling first in New York and later to Pennsylvania, to labor as a migrant worker. The pay was meager, the work brutal, and the separation from his family agonizing, but he endured it to send money back to Pietrelcina. That sacrifice paid for Francesco's schooling and eventual entry into the seminary. It was a pattern that would mark Francesco's whole life. Suffering offered up for a greater purpose. As an adolescent, Francesco's health remained frail. He suffered from frequent fevers, stomach pains, and debilitating headaches. At times, his condition was so severe that he fainted while working in the fields. His mother often feared he would not live long. Yet amid these physical struggles, he continued to deepen in prayer. He would spend long stretches of time in the tiny church of Sant'Anna, kneeling in silence. The villagers, some amused, some awed, began to call him the little friar. He wore simple clothes, but sometimes wrapped a piece of rope around his waist beneath his shirt, an early sign of the ascetic practices he would later adopt as a Capuchin. When he was around 14, he began to sense with certainty that God was calling him to become a Franciscan. The Capuchin friars, with their austere brown robes and life of poverty, appealed to him more than any other order. He told his parents that this was what he wished for above all else. His mother, though proud, was also fearful. Her son's health was so poor that she wondered whether he could endure such a rigorous life. But she trusted in God's providence and gave her blessing. At 15, Francesco presented himself to the Capuchins at Morcone, a monastery not far from his village. He was received as a postulant, and in January 1903, he donned the rough brown habit and the rope cincture with its 3 knots symbolizing poverty, chastity, and obedience. From that day forward, he was no longer simply Francesco Forgione. He became Brother Pio, taking the name in honor of Saint Pius. But before that decisive entrance, his adolescence had already been marked by mystical experiences that hinted at the extraordinary life ahead. In his letters, written years later to his spiritual directors, he described how as a teenager he sometimes fell into ecstasies during prayer, losing all awareness of time and place. Once, while praying the rosary alone in the fields, he became so absorbed in contemplation that he did not notice a sudden thunderstorm. His companions, who had run for shelter, later returned to find him drenched, kneeling in the mud, still murmuring his prayers as though he were standing before the throne of God. He also began to practice small acts of mortification, though always hidden. He would give away portions of his food to other children or secretly fast, pretending to be full when in fact he was hungry. Once, his mother scolded him for refusing meat, fearing he would weaken further. He answered simply, "Mama, I wish to imitate our Lord." She shook her head at what she considered youthful exaggeration, but there was a seriousness in his eyes that silenced further questions. His adolescence was also filled with trials of the spirit. The devil's assaults, which had begun in childhood, grew more violent. He experienced nights of terror when he heard voices mocking him, telling him he was unworthy of the priesthood. At times he felt blows on his body, though no one else was present. These invisible battles exhausted him physically and mentally, but he never abandoned prayer. Instead, he clung more fiercely to his guardian angel, whom he claimed appeared to him often console him and encourage him. He later told his spiritual children that from the time he was a boy, he had spoken to his guardian angel as naturally as to a friend. By the time he entered the Capuchins at Morcone, young Brother Pio had already lived a childhood and adolescence unlike any other. He was no stranger to suffering, no stranger to visions of light and darkness. He had grown up in poverty, endured fragile health, and wrestled with both heavenly consolations and diabolical terrors. But all of this, he believed, was God's preparation. He was now ready to begin the next stage of his journey, clothed in the rough habit of St. Francis, ready to offer himself entirely to Christ. On January 6, 1903, the feast of the Epiphany, 15-year-old Francesco Forgione crossed the threshold of the Capuchin monastery at Morcone and exchanged his simple peasant clothes for the rough brown habit of St. Francis. The coarse fabric itched against his skin, and the heavy had seemed almost too large for his thin frame. A rope cincture was tied around his waist, its 3 knots standing as a silent reminder of the vows he would one day profess: poverty, chastity, and obedience. He was no longer Francesco. He was Brother Pio, named after Pope Saint Pius V, the Dominican pope who had fought for the faith with unshakable zeal. The novitiate was not easy. The Capuchins lived a life of strict discipline, simplicity, and prayer. Their days began before dawn, when the monastery bells called them to matins in the chilly chapel. The friars fasted regularly, slept on straw mattresses, and wore sandals even in the biting cold of winter. For a boy of delicate health, it was an ordeal. Brother Pio often trembled with fever. His stomach rebelled against the coarse food, and his thin body weakened under the rigors of the life. At times he collapsed in chapel or in the refectory, and his superiors wondered if he would survive. But he persevered, clinging to the cross that hung around his neck, convinced that this was where God wanted him. His fellow novices noticed his intensity. While they prayed devoutly, Brother Pio seemed to disappear into another world. His eyes closed, his hands folded tightly. His face set in an expression of both suffering and serenity. At times he would remain motionless for so long in prayer that they wondered if he was asleep. But when they looked closely, they saw tears sliding down his cheeks, or lips moving in a whisper only heaven could hear. He was living, even then, in a constant dialogue with God. A scene from those years reveals both the frailty of his body and the strength of the soul. During Lent, the friars were given even less food than usual, often only bread and water at midday. One evening, Brother Pio, already weak from fever, returned to his cell after the meal and fainted on the floor. His novice master found him later, half-conscious, lips still moving in prayer. When asked why he had not told anyone of his weakness, Pio replied simply, "Our Lord suffered much more." In January 1904, he made his simple vows, binding himself for 3 years to the Capuchin life. He then moved on to study philosophy and theology at various friaries, including Sant'Elia a Pianesi and Serra Caprile. The journey was difficult, for his health never improved. In fact, at times it worsened so drastically that he was sent home to Pietrelcina to recover. His mother wept at the sight of her son, pale and emaciated, yet burning with love of God that seemed to consume him from within. He would spend hours in his tiny village church, sometimes prostrate before the tabernacle, offering up his sufferings. It was during these years of study and convalescence that extraordinary mystical phenomena began to intensify. Padre Pio would later describe how he experienced what he called the invisible stigmata. While praying alone, he suddenly felt sharp, searing pains in his hands, feet, and side, as though nails and a spear were piercing his flesh. Yet no wounds appeared outwardly. He bore the pain in silence, sometimes collapsing in agony in his room. In a letter to his spiritual director, he wrote, "I cannot tell you what torment I feel in my hands and feet. It seems as though something sharp has pierced them. The pain is so strong that it makes me cry out, yet I am ashamed to let anyone hear me. I beg the Lord to keep these wounds hidden, for I desire nothing but to suffer in secret for him." Such experiences frightened him at times, but more often they filled him with a deep joy. He felt himself sharing in the passion of Christ, entering into the mystery of the cross not just in spirit, but in his very body. These hidden sufferings became the foundation of his entire priesthood. In 1907, at the age of 20, he took his solemn vows, consecrating himself forever to the Capuchin life. His studies continued, though always interrupted by illness. The friars began to notice that young Brother Pio seemed to know things he could not possibly know. When fellow seminarians came to him for advice, he sometimes revealed details about their lives they had never spoken of. He had what would later be recognized as the gift of reading hearts. At the time, it was disconcerting, but those who knew him best realized that his intense prayer life had opened him to extraordinary graces. Finally, on August 10, 1910, At the age of 23, he was ordained a priest in Cathedral of Benevento. His family was present, filled with joy and awe. His father, who had labored for years in America to fund his son's studies, now wept openly as he saw Francesco transformed into Padre Pio. The new priest's first Mass was celebrated in his hometown of Pietrelcina, at the Church of Our Lady of the Angels. The villagers crowded into the little church, and many were struck by the sight of the young priest, pale and fragile, raising the host with hands trembling not from fear, but from a profound sense of the mystery he held. Those who attended later said they felt as though the heavens had opened during that Mass. The first years of his priesthood were not what he expected. His health collapsed soon after ordination, forcing him to spend long stretches back in Pietrelcina with his family. He could not remain in the friary for extended periods, and his ministry was limited. Yet God used these hidden years to deepen his interior life. Day after day, he heard confessions in the small village church, guiding simple peasants with extraordinary insight. Penitents reported that he seemed to see directly into their souls. He would stop them mid-sentence, gently but firmly pointing out sins they had concealed or forgotten. It was both humbling and liberating. Word began to spread that this young priest was no ordinary confessor. It was also during this period that Padre Pio began to experience violent assaults from the devil. The torments he had known as a child now grew more intense. At night in his family home, his mother would hear crashes and shouts coming from his room. When she entered, she sometimes found the furniture overturned and her son bruised and bleeding. Padre Pio explained that the devil hated his mission as a priest and sought to break him through fear and physical attack. He bore these torments with patience, offering them up for the salvation of souls. "The devil is like a chained dog," he once remarked. "He can bark loudly and leap, but he cannot bite unless we go too close." In 1916, his life took a decisive turn. He was assigned to the friary of San Giovanni Rotondo, a remote and windswept town on the Gargano Peninsula. The friary, perched on a mountain, was poor and isolated. Few could have imagined that this obscure place would soon become one of the most famous pilgrimage sites in the world. Padre Pio arrived quietly, still sickly, still battling unseen trials, yet carrying within him a fire that would soon blaze forth. At first, life there was ordinary. He prayed with his brethren, celebrated Mass, and heard confessions. But the extraordinary graces that had marked his youth continued to deepen. In one of his letters to his confessor from this time, he described a mysterious event. "While I was hearing confessions, I suddenly felt my soul pierced with a flaming sword. The pain was so great that I thought I would die, yet at the same moment I felt an indescribable sweetness. I understood that the Lord was giving me a share in his passion. The invisible stigmata had returned with greater force." His confessor instructed him to offer the pain silently and to pray that any outward signs might be hidden, lest they attract attention. Padre Pio obeyed, begging God not to allow visible wounds. For the time being, his prayer was granted. These years of hidden suffering prepared him for what was to come. The war in Europe was raging. Italy was bleeding, and people were searching desperately for signs of hope. Soon, in the little friary of San Giovanni Rotondo, an event would occur that would catapult Padre Pio into worldwide fame: the visible stigmata. But before that moment, he endured long years of obscurity, silence, and pain, offering all for Christ and for souls, living out in secret the drama of the cross. The year 1918 was a turning point not only for Europe, which had just emerged from the nightmare of the First World War, but also for the hidden friar in the remote mountains of southern Italy. Padre Pio, still a relatively unknown priest, had spent 2 years in the friary of San Giovanni Rotondo, battling illness, ministering quietly to the faithful, and enduring the invisible wounds of Christ that had afflicted him since his seminary days. Yet in September that year, His hidden life was about to be thrust into the light in a way he neither sought nor desired. It happened on the morning of September 20th, 1918. Padre Pio was in the choir loft of the small church of Our Lady of Grace, kneeling before a crucifix after celebrating Mass. The war had just ended, but his soul was heavy with sorrow for the countless dead. As he prayed, he was suddenly enveloped in a vision. Before him appeared a mysterious figure, radiant, yet severe, bearing wounds in his hands, feet, and side. From these wounds shot forth rays of light, piercing Padre Pio's body with searing intensity. The pain was overwhelming, but it came mingled with an indescribable sweetness, as though heaven itself were pressing its mark upon him. When the vision faded, Padre Pio looked down at his own hands. They were torn open, bleeding profusely. He lifted his feet and saw the same. A sharp agony burned his side. He received the full stigmata of Christ's passion, visible, bloody, and unexplainable. At first, he tried desperately to conceal the wounds. He wrapped his hands in bandages and gloves, keeping them hidden from the other friars. But soon the bleeding became impossible to disguise. His fellow brothers noticed bloodstains on his habit and on the floor of his cell. They urged him to reveal what had happened, and reluctantly he admitted it. Word spread quickly, and within weeks, pilgrims began to arrive, eager to see the friar who bore the wounds of Christ. The reaction was a mixture of awe, skepticism, and alarm. Many were moved to tears at the sight of him celebrating Mass, his wounded hands trembling as he lifted the host, blood soaking to the linen bandages. Others scoffed, accusing him of fakery or hysteria. Doctors were summoned to examine him. One physician, Dr. Luigi Romanelli, studied the wounds closely and declared them inexplicable. They were deep and painful, yet showed no sign of infection or healing. Another doctor, more skeptical, suggested they might be self-inflicted. Padre Pio himself begged to be spared such scrutiny. In a letter to his confessor, he wrote, "I wish these wounds would close. I am ashamed and afraid, but it seems that the Lord will not grant me this. I can only suffer and be silent." From that day forward, for 50 years until his death, Padre Pio would bear the stigmata. The wounds bled continually, sometimes so heavily that he left bloody footprints on the chapel floor. They never healed, nor did they fester. They were a constant agony, both physical and spiritual, yet he accepted them as a share in Christ's cross. As the news spread, pilgrims poured into San Giovanni Rotondo. The friary, once isolated and quiet, became the center of worldwide attention. Villagers, soldiers, peasants, and aristocrats alike traveled up the rugged mountain road to see the stigmatized friar. Some came out of curiosity, others out of devotion. Many left transformed. They described an atmosphere around him that defied words, an overwhelming sense of holiness, as though one were in the presence of something divine. The greatest impact was felt in the confessional. Padre Pio began to spend hours, sometimes up to 16 in a single day, hearing confessions. Long lines formed outside the friary, with penitents waiting days for their turn. Once inside, they encountered not just a priest, but a man who seemed to see into their very souls. Countless testimonies tell of him interrupting confessions to reveal sins the penitent had forgotten or withheld. A soldier once knelt before him and began his confession. Padre Pio suddenly stopped him and said sternly, "And what about the night you betrayed your wife in Naples?" The man, stunned, admitted the truth with tears. He later testified that he had never told anyone of that sin. Such stories multiplied. A young woman came to confession and recited her sins. Padre Pio looked at her and said, "Is that all?" She insisted it was. He shook his head. "And the child you aborted? Have you nothing to say about that?" The woman collapsed in sobs, overwhelmed both by shame and by relief at being forgiven. These moments, though terrifying to some, brought extraordinary conversions. Hardened sinners, skeptics, even atheists found themselves changed after encounter with Padre Pio. They said that his gaze penetrated them, exposing their darkness, yet offering mercy. For Padre Pio, it was a heavy burden. He often emerged from confessional exhausted, drenched in sweat, and sometimes even fainting. Yet he endured it, convinced that this was his mission, to reconcile souls to God. But it was not only the confessional that drew people. Padre Pio was soon associated with remarkable mystical gifts. Reports circulated of him being in 2 places at once, what the Church calls bilocation. A story is told of a fellow friar who, during World War II, was serving as a chaplain on the battlefield. One night, as bombs fell, the soldier prayed desperately for help. Suddenly, he saw Padre Pio beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder, offering words of comfort. Later, when the friar returned to Italy, he rushed to San Giovanni Rotondo to thank him. Padre Pio, who had never left the monastery, greeted him with a smile and said, yes, that night was a difficult one, wasn't it?" Another tale tells of an American pilot who, during a bombing raid, saw a brown-robed friar in the sky, arms outstretched, preventing bombs from falling on San Giovanni Rotondo. The pilot, shaken, later visited the friary and recognized Padre Pio as the figure he had seen. In addition to bilocation, there were reports of healings. People claimed that after meeting him, their illnesses vanished. A man crippled with arthritis testified that after Padre Pio blessed him, he walked normally. Parents of sick children begged his prayers and later returned to thank him for recoveries doctors could not explain. Even his blood seemed touched with mystery. Pieces of cloth soaked in the blood from his wounds were sent to the sick, and some reported miraculous cures after receiving them. All of this, however, attracted not only devotion but also suspicion. The Church, wary of hysteria and deception, launched investigations. Visitors reported on his confessions, doctors examined his wounds, and theologians debated whether his experiences were authentic. Some friars, uneasy with the crowd and the fame, accused him of being a fraud or falling victim to diabolical illusions. In 1922, the Holy Office imposed severe restrictions on Padre Pio. He was forbidden to publicly celebrate Mass, to hear confessions, or to correspond with his spiritual children. For a time, he lived almost like a prisoner in the friary, cut off from the people who had come to depend on him. The faithful outside were scandalized, angry at the Church for silencing their beloved friar. Padre Pio himself, however, bore it with humility. "I am only a poor friar who prays," he said. "If the Church commands me be silent, I will be silent." The restrictions were eventually lifted, but the controversy never disappeared. For the rest of his life, Padre Pio would walk a delicate line between the adoration of the faithful and the suspicion of authorities. To some, he was a saint, to others, a dangerous fanatic. Yet through it all, he never wavered. His life was not his own, it belonged to Christ. By the late 1920s and 1930s, San Giovanni Rotondo had become a magnet for pilgrims. The once sleepy town swelled with visitors from across Italy and beyond. Trains, buses, and mule carts brought thousands up the mountain roads. They came seeking healing, guidance, or simply the chance to see the man who bore the wounds of Christ. For Padre Pio, it was both a joy and a burden. He longed for silence and obscurity, but he could not turn away the souls God sent him. Behind the fame, his daily life remained simple. He rose early for prayer, celebrated Mass with profound intensity, often taking 2 hours or more to complete it. So absorbed was he in contemplation of the Passion, and spent the rest of the day hearing confessions, writing letters of spiritual counsel, and enduring the endless stream of visitors. At night, he returned to his cell, where the devil continued to torment him with violent assaults. The friar sometimes heard crashes and groans from his room, and in the morning he appeared with bruises and scratches. He would laugh lightly about it, but those close to him knew the suffering was real. Thus, by the midpoint of his life, Padre Pio had become a paradox, a cloistered friar who drew the world to his door, a humble confessor burdened with worldwide fame, a man marked by Christ's wounds, both exalted and persecuted. And through it all, he remained what had always been, a poor friar who prayed, suffered, and loved. By the 1940s, San Giovanni Rotondo was no longer a remote mountain village known only to locals. It had become one of the most visited shrines in Italy, thanks to the friar who bore the wounds of Christ. Padre Pio's life was now a rhythm of prayer, mass, and confessions, punctuated by ceaseless visits from the faithful. Soldiers returning from World War II came to him. Mothers brought their children. Skeptics arrived and left transformed. The simple friary, once quiet, was bursting with crowds. Pilgrims filled the square outside, slept in barns and fields, waiting days for their turn in confessional. But Padre Pio's mission was not limited to spiritual healing. He also wanted to heal bodies, to relieve the terrible suffering he saw in the poor of southern Italy. The war had left devastation in its wake. Poverty, hunger, disease. Padre Pio dreamed of building a great hospital, one that would combine modern medical science with deep Christian charity. The sick poor, he said, are Jesus himself. The dream seemed impossible for a poor Capuchin friar. Yet, in the late 1940s, the project took root. Donations began to pour in from his spiritual children around the world. Engineers and doctors volunteered their expertise. Padre Pio insisted that the hospital be not just a clinic, but a place of dignity, beauty, and compassion. He followed every stage of the construction, asking for updates, blessing the workers, sometimes even scolding them if corners were cut. "This is for God's children," he would say. "Only the best will do." In 1956, after years of effort, the Casa Sollievo della Sofferenza, the House for the Relief of Suffering, was inaugurated. It was a vast, modern hospital, equipped with the best technology of its time, staffed by doctors who understood that their work was not merely technical but spiritual. For Padre Pio, this hospital was a visible sign of his mission, to unite suffering Christ, but also to relieve it when possible. Today, it remains one of the most advanced hospitals in southern Italy, a living legacy of his compassion. Even as he built the hospital, Padre Pio continued his exhausting ministry. Each morning, he rose before dawn to celebrate Mass. Those who attended never forgot it. His Masses often lasted more than 2 hours, for he lingered at each part of the liturgy, visibly absorbed in the mystery. When he raised the host, his eyes brimmed with tears, his wounded hands trembling. Pilgrims said it was like witnessing Calvary itself. Many left shaken, convinced they had seen the sacrifice of Christ renewed before their eyes. After Mass, he would hear confessions. The line stretched endlessly, often hundreds of people long. He sometimes spent 10, 12, even 16 hours in the confessional. His words could be stern. He was known to scold penitents who came without true contrition. "Why do you come here if you are not ready to change?" he would say. Some left angry, but many returned humbled to confess sincerely. And then they experienced his gentleness. He would place a wounded hand on their head, whisper words of forgiveness, and their souls felt renewed. As his fame grew, so too did the miracles attributed to him. Stories abounded of healings: a blind girl who regained sight, a man cured of cancer after receiving his blessing, countless others who found relief from pain or freedom from addictions. Many testified that Padre Pio appeared to them in dreams or visions, offering comfort or warning. His bilocation continued to be reported. Even in faraway places like America and Africa, people swore they had seen the friar in moments of need. Yet fame brought trials. The Church, ever cautious, continued to investigate him. Some bishops doubted the authenticity of his wounds and his gifts. In the 1930s and again in the 1960s, he faced restrictions. His mail was censored, his movements watched, his ministry questioned. Articles accused him of being a fraud or of manipulating the faithful for money. Even within his own friary, some brothers resented the constant crowds and suspected that Padre Pio encouraged a cult of personality. These attacks wounded him deeply, but he submitted to the Church's authority without complaint. The Church is always right, even when she disciplines us unjustly, he once said. Obedience is the greatest sacrifice. He never defended himself, never argued. He simply continued to pray, to hear confessions, to suffer in silence. For his spiritual children, his obedience in trial was perhaps his greatest teaching. The 1950s and 1960s brought both glory and suffering. The hospital flourished, pilgrims increased, and his reputation spread worldwide. Celebrities, politicians, and even popes sought his prayers. Pope Paul VI, though cautious, acknowledged Padre Pio as a man of prayer and suffering who had attracted the world. At the same time, his health began to decline. The wounds, which had bled for decades, weakened him. He suffered from arthritis, asthma, and eventually serious internal illness. Yet he never stopped. Even when too weak to walk unaided, he dragged himself to the confessional, refusing to abandon souls. One of the most striking features of his later years was his joy amid suffering. Visitors expected a man crushed by pain, but instead they found him full of humor. He teased children, joked with fellow friars, and even scolded pilgrims with a twinkle in his eye. His joy was not superficial. It was the fruit of a life offered completely to God. "My true joy," he once said, "is to suffer for love." By the late 1960s, his strength was nearly gone. The lines of pilgrims never ceased, yet he was visibly fading. On September 20th, 1968, the 50th anniversary of his stigmata, he celebrated Mass with difficulty, his body trembling. Thousands gathered, knowing the end was near. The wounds that had bled for 50 years now began to close, mysteriously and without scars, as though his mission was complete. In the early hours of September 23rd, 1968, Padre Pio breathed his last. He died quietly in his cell, rosary in hand, whispering the names of Jesus and Mary. The news spread instantly, and within hours the small town was overwhelmed with mourners. More than 100,000 people came for his funeral. They filed past his body, lying in state, his hands now whole and unmarked, his face peaceful. For those who had known him, his death was not an end but a beginning. They believed that the friar who had carried the wounds of Christ for half a century now interceded for them in heaven. And indeed, devotion to Padre Pio only grew after his passing. Pilgrims still flocked to San Giovanni Rotondo, to the friary and the hospital he built, to pray at his tomb. His name has become synonymous with holiness, suffering, and obedience. But at the heart of his story remains the same truth that marked his childhood in Pietrelcina, his youth as a fragile novice, his priesthood as a confessor, and his old age as a stigmatized friar. He was, as he often called himself, a poor friar who prays. He never claimed greatness, never sought fame. He simply allowed God to use his weakness, his wounds, and his obedience as instruments of grace. And in doing so, he became one of the most beloved saints of the modern church.